Welcome to the session 5 of Development Economics. Today's unit is poverty reduction, and we have Professor Upala Pathrana from the Department of Social Sciences, Open University of Sri Lanka, to take you through the lesson. To begin the lesson, let me ask Professor Vidana Pathrana, why should poverty be reduced?
Yes, I think at least there are 3 reasons why poverty must be reduced in developing countries and maybe in all countries. The first reason why poverty should be reduced is that it's not ethical for a country to have, or it is unfair for a country to have a section of poor people among the rich, right? And it's also very unfair if that section of poor people is as a ratio, as a number, absolute or relative. If it is very high, that is even worse. So the first reason is the fairness. It's unfair for a country, or unethical for a country, to have a large number of poor people among the population. The second reason is when you have so much of poverty in a country, it leads to social unrest. It leads to political tensions. And when there are political tensions and social unrest, a country cannot progress. So that is an economic or socio-political reason why poverty must be reduced. The third one is a narrow economic reason. If there are so many poor people in a country, a lot of people are poor. Say, we said earlier, every second person is poor in a country, or every third person is poor in a country. That would mean that that country does not have a sizable market, because those poor people cannot afford to buy most of what is produced by the business community in that country. So therefore, in strict economic terms, the market share also becomes smaller when you have a lot of poor people in the country. So 3 reasons make the existence of poverty in any country not very sound situation.
Right, which brings me to the next question. So what is poverty reduction?
Yeah, I think before coming to that, I would, I think yes. Yeah, what is poverty reduction? Now, poverty reduction is a mechanism that can be initiated by a government or by a non-government organization to reduce the incidence of poverty among the poorest income groups, poorer income segments. So that's a mechanism that can be introduced to reduce the incidence of poverty among the population, particularly the poorest segments. So it also is a process that makes sure that there is a narrowing down of the divide between poor and non-poor. So that is also another explanation to poverty reduction. So what is poverty reduction? Process that reduces the absolute divide. As population share of the poor people gets reduced, say from 50% to 30% to 20% to 10%, it gets reduced. And you have, to do this, there are quite a number of measures that can be taken by the state or non-governmental organizations. You have the palliative measures, which is known as the painkiller kind of simple measures, which will remove the symptoms of poverty. Then you have the safe net measures. They have the structural measures that can be initiated by the state, and also you can have the pro-poor policies. So these are the number of measures that can be used to ensure poverty reduction. If you look at differently, you can increase growth, you can increase human development, you can create conditions that enable human development, you can create conditions that enable economic development. When you do all those things, plus removing income inequality in a country, poverty reduction naturally occurs.
Right, which brings us to the next question. How should a country reduce poverty?
Yeah. Now, a country can reduce poverty, or rather, any country or the world can reduce poverty by removing the causes of poverty. What are the causes of poverty? Now, the first cause of poverty can be the policy framework of a country. If a country, I think, now we know that people have been talking about the economic liberalization as a bad policy in terms of poverty reduction. There are enough and sufficient data worldwide to show that whenever the opening up or the liberalization measures are introduced, poverty increases. So policy framework is one cause of poverty. The second cause of poverty is the asset base of a country. Now, the asset or endowments will tell you the size of the country, like USA, which are massive landmass. Canada has that. Australia has that. That is in terms of acres or hectares of land. You can have other minerals and things like that, including petroleum, diamonds, iron and things like that, and also steel, and also sometimes gold. Then you also can have infrastructure, which is also an asset base. Then you can also have connectivity, credit facilities, technology available, human resources development, as we've been always saying. So these are the asset base of the country. There are two other areas that are causes. One is the return to assets. That is, you may have assets, but what is the return that I get for my asset base? For instance, a poor laborer may say that the only endowment he has is his labor. And if he's paid low wages, that is a low return to asset. Take an extreme example of another side of the story, a lawyer who charges a massive sum for a simple appearance. That is his return to labor. Right? Same person, per hour a day or per 8 hours a day, you might see different returns to labor. And likewise, you have different returns to other assets, physical assets as well. So this is about return to assets. Third or fourth criteria rather is the shocks and the shocks that can happen and the vulnerability to shocks. Now, a shock can be, for instance, you becoming sick all of a sudden, or your family member becoming sick is a shock. That's what we call the personal or idiosyncratic shock, which is personal to the person. There can be other shocks which are known as common shocks, covariant shocks, where a tsunami, sweeps the entire area, or cyclone, or a flood, which is a common shock. So all four of them, the policy framework, the shocks, the asset base, the return to assets, when put together, you will see the causes of poverty. So poverty reduction in that sense then has to emanate from the removal of the causes of poverty.
Right. Let us talk about pro-poor policies. What are they?
Yeah. Now, pro-poor policies, you have quite a range of policies as we discussed earlier. We said something about the, the painkiller kind of mechanisms, like just suppose there's a landslide, people go there, give them food, give them clothes, something for that week, for that month, and come back. That's a painkiller. It only removes the symptom. It does not remove the cause of the poverty. So likewise, you have cash grants, you can dole out funds. These are simple proper policies. Then you have other measures like, little more serious ones, like, increase the income levels of poor, which is continuously increasing income levels, like raise the wage rates. Or else for people who don't have jobs, like in India, you give kind of employment guarantee mechanism. For unemployed people, you have 100 days of work, and each day of work you get some amount of money or some amount of cash or some amount of commodity for that period of work. So that's about the employment guarantee. Then you have what Sri Lanka did for long years has been the universal subsidies. We have universally subsidized the education, free education, universal subsidy of health, free health, universal subsidy of food and nutrition long ago. I can remember when I was small, we have a thing called ration book. They are, reduce the ration gives you not free food, but food at a reduced rate, reduced price. So those are some of the things that universal subsidies are for. Then, so these are proper policies. Also, you can have within proper policies to include. You can have things like increasing or enhancing the endowment set, like land grants, water credit, and things like that. Provision of them can be endowment creation. And also you can have redistribution, which is a structural measure, land reforms, tax reforms, housing reforms, and things like that, which can be done, which are more structural, redistributive measures.
Yeah, you just spoke about pro-poor policies. Yeah. Could you also talk about anti-poor policies?
Of course, there is. If you have pro-poor policies, there can be anti-policies. But before going to that, let me just very briefly tell you about the pro-poor stimulus. You have a targeted intervention, like for instance, you're giving land reform, credit, and something. Or you give guaranteed wage and work mechanism, like they do it in India. So when you are given guaranteed work hours and wages, what does it mean? You get buying power, your buying power increases. When you buy more, you spend that to buy something. And when you spend that to buy something, in economics we call that a thing occurs which is known as effective demand. A demand in the society for particular goods and services increase. Like for instance, what is produced in the area, now people can buy because they have money to buy. Then you have, that creates employment, that creates entitlement, and as a result, poverty in the entire area gets reduced. And that is the pro-poor mechanism. So anti-poor mechanism. Anti-poor policies are, this is actually what the World Bank says. World Bank says if you have high welfare expenditure, that will increase the government expenditure. And that will create, if the government revenue is not high, it creates deficit budget. When there's deficit budget, it creates inflation. When there's inflation, you cannot buy goods and services. And when you cannot buy goods and services, your real GDP falls. And when your real GDP falls, you have long-term poverty. And this is the kind of, cycle of anti-poor policies as explained particularly by the IMF and the World Bank.
Yeah, which brings me to poverty trap. Could you tell us about the poverty trap?
Yes. Now, poverty trap is a mechanism that has been happening in some of the poor countries in the world. For instance, I think there were a number of writers on poverty trap. They said, for instance, people don't have no basic education. And that means he cannot count, he is not literate, he does not know basic arithmetics, so he has lower skill base. And then you have, because of that, you have low income because you will not be employed by anybody who require semi-skilled or skilled work. And as a result, your wage is low. Then you have, because your income is low, you cannot save. Your savings fall. And because you have no savings, you cannot invest on your own houses, you cannot invest on your education, your children's education, so your investment base is low. And as a result, your investment, low investment base, your productivity falls. Not only your productivity levels of generations fall because you cannot spend on the education of your kids, children. So as a result, again low productivity, again leading to low income, again leading to no basic education. So it's a trap where people are continuously being involved in a kind of a vicious cycle. So that is poverty trap.
Right, which also brings me to a very important question. What are the other manifestations of poverty?
Yeah, I think we just look at the rough numbers of poverty, national level, but there are other very important aspects of poverty within a community, within a country. For instance, you may have poverty very high in certain provinces vis-a-vis other provinces. So that is inter-country poverty. Not inter-country, intra-country, within-country poverty. So within-country we'll have intra-provincial, intra-district, or intra-village poverty, right? So, for instance, as we know, the urban sector of the country has a poverty incidence of 9%, which compares with the estate sector, which has about 30% in 2005. So that is the kind of a intra-country, intra-province, intra-sectoral poverty, which is one important. Second one, within a household, also you can have intra-household poverty. For instance, within a household, the old people don't have income. Old people don't have income sources. They don't have mechanism to earn money. And also in most poor houses, women don't have income mechanism, or even if they have income mechanism, it is spent not her own well-being, but the well-being of the entire family. So 2 or 3 categories of people who are mostly affected by intra-household poverty are the old people, the women, and the children, right? And then you also have the feminization of poverty, which is related to what we said earlier. Poverty is seen as something that is very closely linked with the feminization. In most countries, particularly most developing countries, the women who are poorly paid. And there is a stark distinction between or gap between the wage rates that are paid to women and wage rates that are paid to men in most skilled jobs, even in skilled jobs. So these are some of the manifestations of poverty that you would see in the world today.
Right. Professor Vidana Patrana, to conclude this unit, could you give us a summary of what you have just taught us now?
Yeah, I think it is better for us to combine both sessions. And I think in the first session we said poverty is a profound deprivation of capabilities. And its reduction requires, therefore, a very serious commitment, a very serious effort by the individuals on the one hand and the state on the other. So the responsibility of poverty reduction, I would reckon, depends more on the state than the non-governmental agencies or the individuals. And that is where we say that palliative measures, as we said earlier, which are short-term, which can remove the symptoms of poverty, but they cannot structurally remove poverty. Structural removal of poverty can come from the policies of the state and the commitment of that state to those policies. For instance, if a country requires land reforms, I think a lot of countries, for instance, history shows that South Korea, which became one of the fastest developing countries in the world, grew partly because of the original land reforms that it introduced. It has the land reforms, but also it also has the commitment to ensure that land reforms policies are continued, implemented. So, therefore, palliative measures cannot work that way. Only the structural measures can work that way. But in the short term, of course, you can have palliative measures like doling out money, giving some incentives for people who are affected by some of the shocks and vulnerabilities. Yes, that is possible. But public policy must create more opportunities in the society, especially more opportunities to remove the elements of poverty trap, the conditions of poverty trap. And therefore, what is very important for any country to see a sustained poverty reduction program is to have a structural policy scheme so that that country continues working on the removal of poverty as a committed development goal.
Thank you very much, Professor Vidana Patrena. That brings us to the end of session 5 of Development Economics, titled Poverty Reduction. As always, let me suggest that you go and read your relevant unit in the textbook in order to consolidate this knowledge. Thank you.